Welcome to Category Dominators, a new series where we talk with some of the most talented founders and CEOs in the cloud ecosystem. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Bob Muglia, a legend and powerhouse in the tech industry, having shaped some of the biggest names in enterprise software. Bob reshaped the entire big data landscape with his construction of Snowflake, which he grew from zero revenue into a $60+ billion company. Prior to that, he was one of the early executives at Microsoft, building incredibly successful products such as SQL Server and Visual Basic. Welcome, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks, Andy. It's always great to see you.
How have you been?
I've been good. Just trying to build some companies.
You're just never going to stop. Can't stop, won't stop.
What would I do if I stopped? I don't know what to do if I stopped.
So, Bob, I'd love to talk to you about just you and your life and your journey and what you were doing at Snowflake. There's so many weird little things that you and I know about Snowflake, which is this monstrous, successful public company. What is it worth? $60-70 billion now. It was just a really cool and unlikely success story given the origins of the company. And so what I'm interested in is I'd love to talk a little bit about your background, your human self, your childhood and upbringings for a few minutes before we get into the Snowflake story.
Sure. So I grew up in Michigan, in a place called Brighton, near Ann Arbor. It's about 20 minutes outside of Ann Arbor. I went to school. I have an undergraduate degree in computer science from the University of Michigan. And right after I graduated, I got on an airplane and flew out to Silicon Valley. Worked for a company called ROLM, R-O-L-M. They built telecommunication systems for business. Were the first real digital PBX at the time, in the days, but when the PBXs mattered, when phones mattered and things like this.
I remember those days.
This is the early 1980s. You got to go back that far. I spent 7 years there and then got married. My wife and I my wife really realized how, she's a Stanford MBA. She realized how important the PC was. And her view was that the PC was the future, and the company that had both application software and operating system software was the likely winner. So we went up to Seattle and we both wound up joining Microsoft. I stayed there for 23 years until 2011. My job was what they call program manager, which is really to work with customers and define what the product needs to be, working closely with engineering. It's a good part of what a typical Silicon Valley product manager does, but it's more technical than many Silicon Valley product managers are. Very, very focused on the technology and how the product should be built. At the time, I was fortunate enough to work, very closely with Steve and Bill and a number of other great leaders at Microsoft, like Paul Maritz, who I really consider my mentor. Learned a ton from these amazing people. It's amazing. This week, they're celebrating their 50th anniversary, if you can believe it. Microsoft is now 50 years old. It's hard to imagine. But I was fortunate to be in the room when virtually every business decision was made in enterprise software that Microsoft ever did.
Why do you think they had you in that room?
Well, because I was building my product. My first product was SQL Server, and it was really the first enterprise product we had. I mean, it was literally Microsoft's first enterprise product, and I was doing server work for most of my career. So I was kind of in the middle of everything. And what I did at Microsoft a lot was I worked on something for a couple of years, and then they moved me to something else that needed to be fixed. So I was a fix-it kind of guy, and I grew in management there. So I started as a product manager, and I started managing people within my first year. Then grew through the levels of that, became a vice president in 1995. And in 1996, basically ran the developer division. That's the year we built Visual Studio. We brought together C++ and Visual Basic. Those guys hated each other. They hated each other. They were competing with each other, not focusing on the customer. So we instead built a product that included both of them and forced them to work together. Ran the server group for a number of years.
SQL Server. What a geeky thing to do. If you're looking at Microsoft, you're like, okay, we need to win the desktop wars. We got to beat all these guys. The whole thing with GUI was happening, as we recall it. It was like such a big deal. But then you go and tack over from Microsoft. These guys had the vision, or you had the vision to be like, well, let's go build a database that's going to be monstrously successful. What was behind the expansion of the product vision that's such a departure from the basic mission of a user-facing productivity engine? That's like a non-linear move. What drove that?
You got to go back a long ways. You go back really, before there was Windows was at all successful.
Well, by the way, in this podcast, people are now going to get a little bit of history on Microsoft and category domination, creating a $3 trillion thing. and Snowflake. So that's a twofer.
Yeah, there's a lot of lessons. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from Microsoft. You know, in the early days, Microsoft was just a desktop business, but they recognized pretty quickly that the world of business software was very important, and that eventually the PC would grow up to have the capabilities to run business software for at least for many companies.
Hmm.
And when I first joined, there was DOS, and there was Windows 3.1, which was really a piece of junk. I mean, barely usable. And there was a product called OS2. I was actually one of the OS2 program managers. I was the guy that was in the room and actually did the presentation the day we decided to kill OS2 and at Microsoft at least, and focus and depart from IBM, divorce with IBM, and build this Windows NT thing and create a programming layer called Win32. Um, and anyway, we were building, there was a recognition that there was a need for business software. Database was critical to that. And what Microsoft originally did is they licensed the software from Sybase, which had built a really world-class database. It was running on Unix servers at the time, and we did a licensing deal to run it on the PC. And at the time on OS2, later on Windows NT. So it was early days, and I was the first guy that actually, the first version of SQL Server that ever shipped out of Microsoft was an OS2 product, and I literally put that box together myself, literally.
I think of you as an early Microsoft kind of quasi-founder type of person, as you're articulating, even though you're not taking the credit. I think other people that know you and know Microsoft and have for, decades or more, would say Bob Moo was one of the guys, one of the key people. We know Bill at least, and some of these other people had just insane vision. But it was kind of narrow. Desktop could be done by anybody. It could be Apple, it could be IBM, could be all these different players, it could be DEC, Canoe. Yet you guys had the DNA to look downstream, downfield, if you will, and see that the evolution of the productivity machine that you're describing all of a sudden becomes a critical, essential tool of all businesses. What is SQL Server now? $30 billion business for Microsoft? 40, 50?
Annually, not quite that much, but it's really generated much more than it's in the teens in business side. It's crazy big. It's a crazy big business, and it's still growing. That's the other thing. It's still growing to this day. So
It's an icon. It's an icon.
yeah.
So the cool question I have for you is this. What did you see in the customer interaction early on where you're like, okay, this is going to drive category domination?
Well, the reality was, remember, customers were working with very big, very expensive systems. And our value proposition was quite simple, which is we will provide the capability of those systems at a much lower cost and make them available to a much broader set of your users. In some senses, it's not that dissimilar. I borrowed or stole from the Microsoft approach when we helped to build Snowflake, because one of the things that Snowflake did was it brought databases to many people within a company, where in the past it had been restricted to just a small number of people because of the capabilities and the limitations of those systems. But what SQL Server and Windows NT Server did in the early days, probably more than anything, is it brought modernized business computing and business applications to business of every size. In the 1980s, if you were one of the big banks or a big company, you had, large data centers that you were running and you ran your business with that software. But if you were a medium or small business, you were working mostly on pencil and paper. You remember, the dentists of the world, almost every small business in the 1980s was all pencil and paper, and accountants with adding machines. And we changed that. Microsoft was the thing that changed that. It was Windows Server, SQL Server, and then applications often written in Visual Basic that were the first generation of business applications that brought business computing to companies of all sizes all around the world, which I'm extremely proud of, because we brought the modern technology down to companies that never could afford it before. And that's the biggest thing we did.
What I'm trying to get to is okay, early days of Microsoft, you see all these transformation happening, but you guys were connected to the market at such a intimate level, even though you're talking about millions and millions of small businesses. What was the behavior that you saw happening around the Microsoft conversations where it enabled you to dominate the space?
In a large sense, it was because basically these industries had these companies like IBM and Digital Equipment Corporation, a few others, but let's take those two as predominant ones. We're building, HP was another one back then, that had been building this software on Unix and had created these large machines. And meanwhile, there's a whole new generation of companies like Compaq and Dell that recognized you could take modern Intel chips and for a fraction of the price, build a machine that had equivalent power and capability to these much more expensive proprietary systems. And what they needed was standardized software to make it work. And, this is because of the work that Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and others had done early on, had built deep relationships with these OEMs that where we were already supplying software. So it was a relatively straightforward thing as we were able to come up with it.
If you're supplying to an OEM, you're not connected to customers. That must have meant that they were out touching customers all the time.
They were, but customers connected with us. I mean, we were, the other thing that happened in that time frame, this is where, again, I think SQL Server played a really big role because it was the primary product that we brought to market through our enterprise sales force. But one of, Steve's great contributions to Microsoft was building a world-class sales organization, an enterprise sales organization. And that started around 1990, 89, 90 in that period. So in that period of the 90s, when the software was maturing, and really SQL Server and Windows NT weren't decent until the mid 90s. Let's say it was mid 95 or something like that. By the time the software got good, there was actually a direct sales force. Now I say direct, but back then everything went through the channel. There was channels for everything, and we worked through distribution on all of our software. And the thing to remember, and I always remind people of this, is back then when you were a value-added reseller, you would go into a customer, and the first thing you did is you opened the closet where the server was going to go, and you cleaned the mouse turds out of the closet. And then you hooked the wires up for the net with a small network that was going in there.
Oh, that's amazing.
I mean, there was a need to be very hands-on in terms of working directly with the customer. And Microsoft had built these channels that allowed us to do distribution with a very broad set of customers all around the world.
But still keep connectivity to the customer. A lot of times when people go channel, as you know, they lose connectivity to the market and you're under someone else's thumb.
This is the brilliance of Microsoft, was that there was that direct sales force that allowed them to basically, and they made money when the resellers made money. So they were able to stay there. Plus, we had other mechanisms we were able to use, like conferences and things like that. We had an annual professional developers conference. We had this thing called Tech Ed where people came in. And so there were a lot of ways we touched, plus our support organization where we directly supported customers. There was a lot of ways we got direct touches with customers, and we learned a lot. Now, the interesting thing back then is that the feedback loop took months, even years. It was the most frustrating thing in the world, where a customer would give us feedback, and my team in product management program management would define the feedback and define what to build. And then the engineers would build it. And it often took 3 years between the point where where the customer defined the problem until the new software came out. And even worse, it could take another 3 years before the damn customer rolled it out, because they had to do the installations themselves. So the feedback loops were measured in months and years. Now in SaaS, in the modern world, they're measured in days and even hours.
When you looked around the table, what was everybody playing for? We're like, oh, we're going to change the world with these productivity systems and bring people in the modern age. Like, what was the transcendental purpose that got everybody in the office?
At Microsoft?
Yeah, what was everybody playing for?
To change the world. I told everybody I interviewed that you're coming here because you want to change the world, and this is the place where you can actually make
bringing the world into the digital age. That's
to move the world into a digital age, and in fact, to change the way people live their lives and the kinds of experiences that they can have. And Microsoft really did that and has done that more on the business side, frankly, than on the consumer side.
Well, they owned the consumer for a long time till they ceded it, as you know, to
a lot of stories that could go through, could be gone through there that are not so pleasant. There are a lot of not so pleasant.
Well, I don't think a lot of our viewers understand this, but it's a pretty funny story that which is that Microsoft could have bought Apple for about $1 billion at the time in the mid-90s.
Yeah, but Steve Jobs could never have worked for Bill, and they would have both killed each other.
It wasn't his choice. Gil Amelio was the CEO at the time.
If that's the case, then Microsoft would have killed Apple. They would have made it.
I understand. But what I'm saying, we look at this iconic $3 trillion thing that we view as Apple. It lives in our lives and pervasively. And a lot of people don't realize the company almost hit the wall.
And it was Microsoft that bailed Apple out.
Bailed them out.
When Steve Jobs
gave Apple, went to crash. Right. Saved their ass.
And we got a patent. What we got was a patent cross license. We got out of a patent lawsuit. That was definitely a two-way street. Whereas that
You were kind of fighting the antitrust guys at the time, I recall.
And, and Apple had done a lot of core work in the graphic user interface, and they had some key patents. And so we were able to, it was a win-win, a true win-win situation. We avoided a lawsuit we didn't want to have, and we injected cash to Steve Jobs exactly when he needed. And then he went on to build the iPod and and the iPhone eventually and everything else. And of course, give Steve Jobs the credit for what he created.
I give him all the credit in the world. It changed our lives. But it's so fascinating to me. I saw this thing in LinkedIn earlier today. This founder is talking smack about this other founder. I'm like, who does that openly? What kind of clown does that? And very few, and especially the A crowd. You'd never see the A crowd talking about their competitors at all. And so I'm kind of curious how you guys were looking at Apple and being like, shit, these little guys, they might actually have something over there. But they were like the tiny little fast follower and trying to, really beat you guys on user experience quality. What were you thinking about? How were you like thinking about them?
Well, it depends on when you're talking about. Most of the time, until the mid 2000s, Mac was 5% or less market share.
It was.
It was diminutive. It was almost irrelevant. I mean, the only guys at Microsoft that even thought about it were the Office guys, and the people in Office who worked on the Mac were second-class citizens because Windows was the center. It was the sun, and everything revolved around Windows when Steve Ballmer was CEO of Microsoft. And it wasn't really until, the mid-2000s when Apple started gaining more steam, particularly when we had the Vista debacle and we started releasing some versions of Windows that were terrible. And Apple capitalized on that very, very brilliantly. And, then the world started to change, and Microsoft's ability to effectively sell to consumers was dramatically impacted, frankly, by stupid mistakes on our own part, certainly, but also by great execution from companies like Apple and other companies in different spaces like Google.
Good stuff. Okay, here's the last question. You were kind of viewed, I recall, as the enfant terrible, like the brilliant product guy that brought out these ridiculously successful products that thumped the shit out of competitors. But if you think about, you kind of dealing with this large company, it's mature, it's kind of playing risk management. You got Ballmer coming in. He's a sales guy. He's not really a product technical kind of person. In 25 lifetimes, I'll never even dent what he's done in the world. I'm not trying to take the guy down in any way. But we know what his weaknesses were. Microsoft kind of missed a lot of boats while he was there. They just did. You were kind of the glass-breaking enfant terrible is sort of how I look at you. Like, did you really tell him to F off?
Cut my fingers on that glass a couple of times too, by the way. My fingers got a little bit, but I mean, look, I always push back. I learned an enormous amount from Steve. I'll start by saying I just learned so much from Steve. The way he thought about sales and helping to build channels and things and pricing, all 80% of my knowledge in those spaces came from Steve Ballmer. So I learned an amazing amount. I had some different views than he had on a number of things about how to work with customers and how to build businesses.
But you were basically willing to put your badge on the table and tell people like, you're wrong constantly. You were like a guy who was standing out being like, this is bullshit. I'm not going to allow you guys to screw up customer experiences. At least that's what I sort of recall.
No, I do think that's fair because, I was running at the time, and go back to the mid 2000s beyond. I was running the server and tools business. It was a 10 billion plus, revenue business. When I left, it was 17 billion in revenue. That's tiny in Microsoft sort of current terms, but at the time it was pretty big. And it was multiple businesses. It was multiple gigantic businesses: Windows Server, SQL Server, Visual
Where did
Studio.
you depart from Ballmer? Was it more like you were just obsessed with customer excellence, and then he was sort of like, well, I'll just sell what I have?
A classic was when, Steve and Bill were always obsessed with intellectual property and what Linux could do to Windows and the potential for open source software to destroy our core businesses. And so they built this substantive intellectual property patent portfolio that they thought they could use aggressively against somebody to prevent the incursion of Linux and ultimately products like Android. I mean, that's ultimately where it really did make a major incursion into Microsoft. I remember one day when Steve said he wanted to sue my customers, my Windows Server customers, because they were using Linux. And I said, please don't do that. Please, please, please don't do that. I don't need that. I don't want that. And you're just going to cause a huge amount of problems. So that's an example where I pushed back, and I think I was successful in that case.
Let's talk a little bit about, I want to talk over to Snowflake, which is just a fun story. All right. So the way I recall things is that I think Spicer and one of his partners were talking to you about a security company because you were coming out of Juniper. You went from Microsoft to Juniper to run the security business. You probably didn't want to be the security guy in a company that sold routers to the core of the internet. Is that about right?
Yeah, I left Microsoft in 2011 and I joined Juniper for a couple of years. That got me back to the Bay Area, which was good. Although I maintained my house up here in Seattle. My wife never really moved down. But I was living down in the Bay Area running a part of Juniper, a division of Juniper, and eventually came to the conclusion that that wasn't the right thing. This was like 2013, early 2014, when the cloud was really taking off. I mean, it was the time when the cloud was beginning to accelerate. At that point, still the only viable cloud vendor was AWS. Microsoft was still very much in its infancy with Azure, and Google was kind of really not even in the picture for all practical purposes back then. But AWS was really starting to take off, and I realized the opportunity for a next generation of software was going to be created in the cloud. And I had spent most of my career fixing stuff that was broken. That's what I did at Microsoft, and that sure is what I was trying to do at Juniper. Sometimes successfully, maybe not always successfully.
I remember this company. A bunch of founders came out of Cisco or something like that. They were trying to do like this hardware product for security.
Stefan Dykoroff at Sutter Hill, who was my contact into Sutter Hill, he was a partner of mine at Juniper.
Good guy.
Juan and I had a great relationship, and
Great.
he was building a company that was a security-oriented company with a bunch of ex-Juniper people.
All right. So you almost joined that company. I think I recall us having a conversation where I don't recall the details, but I thought we were debating whether you should go to security and go into Snowflake. And we had this long conversation. I recall, I don't know, this is what, 12 years ago or something?
This 2014, yeah.
What drove you to say, okay, I'm not doing the security company, I'm going to go join this company? Because let's be honest, when we rewind history, we rewind our lives, you had this ragtag little team. You had these two founders, French guys. You got Spicer, who's a superstar, but nobody knew, what a superstar he was at the time. There was no reason for you to really look at or go to Snowflake. And it looked like it was going to be battling against a business that Amazon was growing 1,000% a year. You had, like I said, the open source community, you had Hadoop, all this other crap percolating. And so what the hell were you thinking joining Snowflake or even talking to them? Like, you're a pretty big hitter running these billion-dollar businesses and you got this little ragtag start, no revenue, shitty little office in San Mateo.
Well, sort of backing up a little bit, like I said, the cloud was emerging. I really felt like I wanted to do something in the cloud. I had been involved in working with and fixing crap at big companies for my entire career. I decided I wanted to build something from the early days. That's the first thing. So that's why I was looking at small companies. I was looking at a few big companies as well, but every time I talked to them, my heart sank. And I started thinking, so I started talking to startups. And, the security company you're talking about, Stefan had connected me with them and a bunch of guys I already knew. So that was some interest. Security wasn't my favorite thing. I'd just been burnt out with security at Juniper. Security was rough at Juniper. So I was a little bit fatigued on security. Let's put it that way.
It did seem a little odd too that those founders were so excited about hardware in the era where like, well, okay, well, we're commoditizing everything
There
with
was a few
hardware.
things that were a little bit challenging there. They were hardware guys. The problem is if you're a hardware guy, you're always a hardware guy. And that's one of the other things I learned at Juniper, which is a hardware company. So I went up to San Mateo, directly from that company, it turned out, had my interview the first day. And Snowflake's way of doing interviews is they take a group of people and they kind of put the candidate in there and they sort of ask them to present something. And so, I don't remember what I was presenting on, but they asked me to present something because that's part of what they did. And then they described, Benoit, Terry, and Marcin, the three founders, described what they were doing. And Chris Degnan was there, I remember, very clearly. John Bach, one of the early employees. And I listened to these guys, and what they said was interesting to me. Remember, I'm a database guy, right? I've been working with SQL Server for years. I understood databases pretty darn well. We also helped to build Exchange, which is basically built on a database too. And so I was listening to what they said, and they basically claimed that by working with the cloud, they could remove the limitations that existed in classic SQL databases in terms of the data size, the types of data, the number of simultaneous users. And I realized if they could really do that, then that would be a very big deal. That'd be a game-changing thing. And I understood how that business I instantly understood how, if that was successful, and remember at that point, that was a big if. It was, there was no There were no customers back then. There were a couple customers running beta software.
And there were a lot of companies saying, oh, I could do a cloud database, or I could do this thing with the open source or whatever. You still had to cut through the noise of the market. I think I recall at least 100 companies saying they were going to approach the same thing.
But not the same way. The thing was, it was not the same way. And that's the key. Back then, Hadoop was all the rage.
Right.
And everybody
exactly.
was Hadoop. I always thought Hadoop was the wrong way of doing things. I mean, it just seemed like a product that it solved a problem at the time which the problem was working with semi-structured data. Where if you looked at Oracle or SQL Server or MySQL or any of these other products, Redshift, any of these other products that work with only structured data, Hadoop worked with data that was more typically generated by applications, semi-structured JSON data, and Hadoop was the only
No
game in
SQL
town.
data was floating.
It was exploding, and Hadoop was the only game in town, but it was not a good game. It was never going. I mean, to me, it was a product that solved a problem, but it solved it the wrong way technically.
And nobody ever put it in production. It was always like these experimental side projects.
That turned out to be the case. I mean, nobody knew that for sure in 2014, but it sure seemed, but that is what happened is that it was never ending issues of getting it into production. Only a few companies were successful with that. But I looked at, I listened to what these guys were saying, and then I spent time with the founders and I dove deep with them. Because although I'm a business guy, I'm also a reasonably technical guy. I'm not a coder. I'm not going to write this software, but I'm pretty technical and understand architectures quite well. And so I spent time with these guys listening to the architecture of what they'd created. And I realized that architecture could work. It made sense that it could work. And essentially that was the core where you separate compute from storage. You have a service that manages the whole thing, and you allowed yourself to scale both compute and storage independently. And storage was S3, so it had all the benefits of S3 with extreme durability, low cost, everything else. But you could also gain the benefits of being able to put as much compute behind that as you ever wanted to.
Okay, I was going to ask you that question. Did Benoit and Thierry and Marcin or Spicer or whoever was at the founding table knock that existential purpose out with you and bring to life the whole, what is separation of compute and storage going to lead to?
Benoit and Thierry did.
Well, you bought into their long-term architectural view of the world. I mean, their immediate term or invention, let's call it the architectural worldview. And then you were thinking, okay, the market's going to really embrace this. It's like, going to love this product.
Right.
You must have looked at Redshift and man, that's a beast. They can keep changing out code anytime they want because it's natively cloud born. And, you'd have to chase them. You knew you were going to come from a way big deficit. They were already doing $1 billion or something at Redshift. And that's a suicide mission to be like, oh, we'll go chase that.
It made funding a little challenging early on. Let me tell you, there were some times when it was a little hard having conversations with VCs.
There was all these people in the venture capital world telling me, even as a gadfly of the company and an early shareholder, that was like, oh, Snowflake's a piece of crap and they're going to have crappy gross margins. And like the haters were everywhere.
Yeah, there were quite a few. There were a few DOS supporters too.
But you just believed, you and Benoit and Thierry and Marcin, you just got in the foxhole with those guys and believed what they believed from an architectural invention point of view, and that was going to translate into market dominance.
The thing that happened with here, Redshift turned out to be our best friend. And the reason it turned out to be our best friend was because Redshift did something that we never could have done, first and foremost, which is it demonstrated the viability of a cloud data warehouse to a broad market. And Amazon's market position allowed them to do that. And there was a lot of adoption of Redshift, a very large amount of adoption of Redshift in the early days of AWS. But Redshift's problem was that it was built, it came from a company called, they licensed the software and effectively got the technology from a company called ParAccel, which was
I remember it.
Decent, not fabulous, but decent data warehouse that was built in an on-premises way. It was a software solution in a world where hardware was predominating. Companies like Netezza and Teradata were really eating up the market back then with hardware-based accelerated solutions. ParAccel was a software-only solution. It was not successful in the on-premises world, but Amazon got the software, ran it very effectively in AWS, but it brought with it the characteristics of on-premises software. It didn't scale. It just didn't scale. And so Redshift worked fantastically well until it didn't. Every customer that would use it in a deep way would hit a wall on it eventually. And we were able to capitalize on that because when the customer hit the wall, the way you got past it was to go move to Snowflake.
So you just let those guys keep running through POCs and then turning customers, and then the customer would be like, okay, now we have an alternative.
Famously, there was a famous sort of, subway ride with one of my first sales guys, Vince Trotta, in downtown underneath Manhattan, where we were going from customer to customer. We were watching, these customers adopting. I just adopted Redshift. I'm 3 months into this deployment. Go away, basically, was the conversation. And Vince looked at me and said, Bob, I promise you, this Redshift is our best friend because in a year, all of these customers are going to hit the wall with Redshift, and then I'm going to go back in and I'm going to win those customers. And that's exactly what we did. And one customer after another would hit this wall, and the only way to get past it was to switch to Snowflake. And we made it very easy to do that. It was very, very easy to make that migration. So that was a lot of our early business.
Purpose of podcast is really to educate young companies and founders on there is things that happen on journey to success and how to. So many companies will be like, oh shoot, if you're Anthropic, how do you chase OpenAI? Now I know what they're doing and how they do it is pretty extraordinary. And people go, oh, OpenAI is worth $350 billion. I look at Anthropic and I'm like, that's a better company for a bunch of different reasons. But a lot of people have this misperception that the first player, you can't be the fast follower and still win.
A lot of times the first player loses, it's not the winner. Google was not the first player in internet search.
Yahoo was.
It was the winner. So a lot of times the winner is actually a fast follower because you can learn a lot. The other early wins we had were on the Hadoop side because part of it was the structured data applications, typical data warehouse applications where Redshift was eating up the market, and then we were coming behind and gobbling up the Redshift failures that we were able to move forward onto Snowflake. The other part of it was customers who were trying to work and analyze log file data. They were using Hadoop for that, and they were struggling. Every customer struggled with Hadoop. And we were like the antidote. I mean, we could come in and have a solution up and running in several days. The customers were spending weeks and weeks, months and months trying to get running in Hadoop.
So you have this collection of people. We didn't have Denise at the time. You have Denise person who's I'm referring to for the audience, who's in my mind the greatest marketer in history of cloud. I just think she's
done an amazing job. Denise is fabulous.
But we didn't have Denise. You didn't have anybody else telling the story.
Hey, Chris Degnan. You had Degnan.
Degnan's making what, 5,000 phone calls a week or something, cold calls. So the lesson to founders is you believe in what you're doing. You hang around the hoop long enough. Someone's going to serve you up the basketball. You dunk the basketball. You're just watching the market percolate. How did you take advantage and all of a sudden you exploded? I remember when you called me that one quarter where you're like, oh, we got this. And we just exploded. And that's where obviously, things got really exciting.
It took a while for the product to mature. Let's start by saying that, when I joined it, it was really a prototype. And so the first year was, me working with the engineering team to help them ship the software. And they were, incredible engineers that were doing an incredibly great job, but they weren't on a path to shipping that software. So I actually kind of took over, to help them drive. And as I wasn't an engineering manager, but I definitely ran the project because I could do that. That was part of my skill set. And part of the early days is when you jump into a customer, into a company like Snowflake, where you're employee number 34, you'd previously worked for this company called Microsoft and this other reasonably big company called Juniper. Part of my job was to prove to everyone that I could get my hands dirty and do stuff. So I did the first sales presentation that we wound up using to actually show to customers, and our salespeople used. When I left, there were salespeople still using slides from that presentation. I created the pricing model that Snowflake used, and it's.
I remember when you guys went to it by the second charging, then everyone was like, what the hell are those guys doing by the second charging?
When I, on a little Google sheet, I remember in June and July of 2014, I started by laying out the COGS, how much it cost us to run a data warehouse. We needed a model that had all the that incorporated all the flexibility of Snowflake, which allowed you to instantiate a data warehouse at any time, change its size, et cetera. So where we were previously thinking of node, the team was thinking of node-based pricing. I said, kill that. Don't want to think about that. Think about these as virtual data warehouses that you can instantiate at any moment in time, and we'll just charge you at the time by the hour. Now it's by the second, actually.
That was amazing.
And so we created that at the beginning, and part of it was in the early days, it's about getting your hands dirty and getting in and doing these things. And so the first thing I helped them to do, in addition to those things, was helping them to ship the software in mid-2015, run the process to understand what it means to hit general availability. Like, for example, the security model has to be complete. You have to be able to secure the data for customers. You had to fully encrypt the data for the customers. So, having all of those capabilities, you had to have a backup strategy. What the hell is your backup strategy? That's where we created Failsafe. And building these concepts into the system that shipped in 2015, that was the beginning. 2015 to 2016 through 2016 was tough because that was the snow what period. When we would go into a customer, they'd say, snow who? Snow what? What are you talking about? And, what would happen there is that, and the way we made it work is we would go in and we would say these things to customers that we could run any number of users and work with all these different data. And, quite often customers who were quite sophisticated, they've been working with data warehouses, they had Netezza, they had Teradata, they had this, they had that. They would say, whoa, stop right here. I know you're bullshitting me because I know what you're saying is impossible. And at that point, what we would do is there was an architecture slide that, I'd work with the engineering team to put together, and we'd deep dive into that architecture and talk about how it was possible and how the cloud had enabled what was previously impossible to be possible now. And when customers got that, they said, wow, does that really work? And we said, yeah, it actually does. Don't take our word for it, try it. And then customers would run trials, we would help them through it, and then we would win customer after customer.
How did you keep this team together and keep yourself motivated? I remember when we put together the offer letter for you, you went for like $200K, if I recall correctly. Here's a guy, what were you at the time? Mid-50s? You've got a family, you've got some bills to pay. You were a believer, and you had to keep all these other people in the boat. Big data was on everybody's coffee table. So people knew that this was a hot market around this theme, which I viewed as BI 2.0, by the way. Like back in the early 90s, people were like, oh, we can do business intelligence. And I look at big data, I'm like, isn't that just BI 2.0? Like BI 1.0 didn't work that well. It's kind of expensive. So if you look at this BI 2.0, big data, cloud data, unstructured data, all these themes, but you're still this ragtag group of people trying to convince people to move off Teradata on one side, the high performance side, and then Redshift, which is sort of the blue collar crowd of data scientists, right? And what they're using, and get into your worldview. How did you keep everybody together amidst all these like vibrating threats going on where it just didn't look like Snowflake was going to happen? It was a multi-year process. And nowadays people are like, oh, I don't think this company's going anywhere in 30 days. And then they move on. It's like you had to keep this core team together for years and wander through the desert. What do you attribute that to?
There's a couple things. I mean, one was that, and I learned this from Microsoft, was being mission driven, really focusing on solving something that matters to people. Your team can get behind and feel like they're doing something good for the world. At Microsoft, originally our mission was to put a PC on every desk and in every home, which was an amazing mission. It was very futuristic when Bill came up with it. At some point, we succeeded with that mission, by the way, in around 2000. Then we kind of lost our way a little bit after that. At Snowflake, our focus was really to democratize data for everyone, make it so that everyone had access to data and could work with data and drive their business. And so having a mission that people believed in and then understanding that we had the technical chops to actually achieve that in a differentiated way certainly kept people motivated. The other part of it was big, and this was something that was created in this groundswell, bottoms-up way at Snowflake. I encouraged it, I participated in it, but it was an effort that was done by the people who was creating the values of the company. And we really believed in those values. Those are still Snowflake's values to this day. The first value is we put our customer first, and we really, really meant it.
You guys were customer obsessed. I remember when Denise came in, we're still pretty small. What, like 10 million?
Yeah, probably if that.
It's that. And she bet on it. And I remember how hard it was to close her. She's like, why would I do this? This is so dumb. That's her, buddy, you guys are crazy. We stayed with her. And, I remember her early moves, and tell me if I'm recalling this incorrectly. I might be senile at this point. That she was sort of like, our marketing principles are going to be centered around customer champions, period. Like that's what's going to go out and tell their stories, customer stories, customers. What are you using? How are you doing it?
Always about the customer. And that's And, focusing on, first of all, being a values-based company, but being a customer-focused values-based company is super important. And Snowflake really believed in our values. We looked at them. I would say that when I had a hard decision, I reread the Snowflake values, because not only did the value itself have meaning, but we would always put several sentences next to it that provided some context for the value.
Now, what were the core values? Just rip off 3 or 4.
Yeah, I mean, integrity always, put the customer first, solve hard problems, problems that matter. It was really focusing on things that mattered to customers, and where we could build a company that customers could trust, because that's the other thing. Oh, think big was that other value. What customers really cared about was not just the product. They always buy the product, but they enter a relationship with the company. And, my goal was always to build a company that people wanted to work with. And, one of my most proud things is that when the first 6 customers, we had 6 customers in 2014. When I left in 2019, they were all still customers of Snowflake, all of those 6. And some of them had grown from 14,000. Our first customer grew from 14,000 to over $1 million in growth. So that's great NRR on that customer.
You had marketing, sales, which are extremely high turnover functions, as you know. Denise and Chris only retired from Snowflake, a month ago.
Yeah.
Was that like 9 years?
He hired every single salesperson that Snowflake ever hired.
So 10-year run for the sales exec. You've got Denise is still there. What is that? 9, 10 years? She came in, pretty early, 9 years. And then you've got product.
Christian Kleinman. I hired Christian.
Christian, yeah. I remember you were like, I should have hired Christian. And he's sort of a guy I knew from my past, and you really believed in him. And he was there for what?
Still there.
So you had 4 of your top leaders. I know you hired Greg right before the IPO, but pretty early. That was a pretty good hire, a very solid hire, it seemed. And you kept those 4 people stayed. Those critical functions turnover all the time. How do you think about, when you look back, what you were looking for in talent that ended up with these people had these really long tenures and all this success? A lot of times this tenure is like, okay, well, I'm kind of rotting over in the corner somewhere. But that group was super engaged all the way to the end, or to current day in a couple of cases. What were you looking for talent-wise that you can attribute to that longevity?
Well, first of all, these are all people that had reasonable amounts of experience. They had real experience in the industry, and they all had a proven track record.
They didn't have billions of dollars of public company revenue under their belts.
No, but they had a proven track record, and they were all hungry. They all wanted to do something. They wanted to prove something. They all had the resilience to be able to grow with the business too. So Chris being the most extreme example of it, because he preceded me and then was still there until just a couple months ago. But they all had the ability to grow as the company grew. But I think the biggest thing is they believed in the mission. They believed in what they were doing. They believed in the values of the company. They felt they were working for one of the greatest companies in the world, and they were making a difference in the world. And I think that's what people want to do. And then, because the company was very successful, they were able to, be successful financially as well. So you put all those things together, and it really motivates people.
It's such a cool story. These people were not celebrity executives before the company. They were kind of unknown. They're buried in larger companies, or they were in like little things like Apogee/Google. So it's super interesting to me how you assembled that team and they became celebrities at your company. I see all these founders out there are trying to be like, oh, I need celebrities right now. I need all these celebrities. And you go, why? And they go, well, because they'll give me a scale. And you go, are you sure? And then you've got all these people that scaled to billions and billions of dollars of the rigors of a public company. Every quarter, marching through time, shipping new product, selling, marketing. It's a truly extraordinary machine.
I think I taught them some early lessons, and I think Frank also taught them some really great lessons.
What were those? What were the key? What are the things that you imprinted on them?
I think a few things. One is the focus on the customer for sure, and the importance of focusing on the customer. The importance of doing the right thing with customers, even when it hurts. Like, you do a refund that you don't really believe you should have to do, but you do it anyway because you want to build the long-term customer relationship. Thinking in the long run. I've always spoken. That's a lesson I learned at Microsoft. Thinking in the long run on things. And realizing that you're building relationships with people that transcend everything. Those relationships transcend time. And it's important to maintain and build those relationships. And also, just listening and also making sure you're hearing what's really happening in the world and being paranoid about what you need to do to change as the world is changing, because the world is always changing.
What'd you do as a leader to make sure they all got along with each other and didn't kill each other? I mean, 'cause you know all the tension points between product and engineering and sales.
Sometimes they didn't get along. That did happen sometimes, but
That's natural human existence. So what I'm saying is they stayed together. What do you attribute that to?
you build a team that knows how to work together and you focus on helping them to resolve issues. And, the way we always did that at Snowflake was in a, way where an issue would come up, we would build a team around trying to solve that issue. And that team was typically a cross-functional team. And they would work together to solve it. If they couldn't come to agreement, they would go up a level, and that we tried to solve it at the lowest level in the organization we possibly could. So teams can, if everybody agrees on an issue,
The noise level down, huh?
easy, just solve it at that level. If they don't agree, go up a level. And if there's still if that person doesn't trust their decision or they feel like they need additional input, continue to go up until it's if some things go to the CEO, but hopefully not that much. Hopefully things get resolved at lower levels in the organization and they
Or
can.
you keep the fire from starting in the lower ranks. That's interesting, actually. When stuff escalates instantaneously, and I mean, the leadership team, you just end up constantly having this thrash and this churn and this angst and battles.
A lot of times things can get resolved easier at the lower levels, but then there's other things that can't. They just can't. And for a variety of reasons, partially because people at higher levels have more context sometimes than people at lower levels. They can do things that, like I would always, people would thrash in something, particularly when it came to a customer issue of some kind. They kind of go back and forth, they spend time, and I'm like, look, raise that to me because I can make one phone call and solve this problem for you. And so if that makes sense, please do that, but don't do it unless you need to. But if you're thrashing, for God's sakes, go up a level to solve it.
Let's talk a little bit about Snowflake against Databricks for just a quick second. Databricks is a savage company. Their founder is I think
He's a beast, Andy. In your words, he's a beast.
animal. I will tell you that the guy, I won't say the details. I will say he had a personal challenge at one point in his life during his journey at Databricks that was not trivial. And he had to deal with that and still work 20 hours a day. And this guy's an unstoppable tornado of a person. And you had that guy breathing up sneaking up your tailpipes. You're not the fast follower, you're the dominator. And then there's always a fast follower coming up your tailpipes. How do you think about marginalizing them or putting the hurt on them? Or will you just think, let's play our own game, let's let them do their thing? How do you think about them?
Well, you're looking at today's world where the two are incredibly competitive with each other, but that wasn't the world I was living in when I was running Snowflake. We built a cloud data warehouse, and that's what we did. We were great at that, structured, semi-structured data. Databricks built Spark, and Spark was really working, it was doing machine learning. It was a platform for machine learning. It was also primarily a platform for data transformation. I mean, 70% of Databricks business back then, and even today, a fair amount of their business is about transforming data to load into a data warehouse. So the reality of the situation was in the teens, 2017, 2018, when both companies were beginning to build some momentum, we were almost perfectly complementary to each other. And most of my customers were also Databricks customers. There was even a point, I mean, I think it was 2017 at AWS reInvent, we had a late night party, a 10 o'clock at night party, which was hosted by both Databricks and Snowflake. And Ali and I seriously discussed merging the two companies. And it was a serious discussion. We were both interested in doing it. And when we went to our boards, it quickly turned out to not. I think the boards correctly determined that there was more value that could be created by building the companies separately. So I don't think the boards made a bad decision. But I mean, in the early days, we were much more partner oriented than we were competitive. Now, over time, and by the time I left, Databricks and Snowflake were becoming more competitive. I think largely because Snowflake had gotten out ahead and we were building, our business opportunity, the business opportunity of data warehousing was larger than the business opportunity of machine learning pre-models, pre the large language models. Now I think things have changed a lot, right? Where the artificial intelligence part of the business, as well as the data management parts of the business, data warehousing business, are both gigantic businesses.
We weren't really worried about Databricks at that time. I mean, you emerged later as a competitor. More.
We always kept our eye on it, and we were always, we always watched what they were doing, but they were doing different things than we were doing. And we were succeeding at what we were doing, and we knew we had a giant market. We knew we had a small share of a giant market, and we were slowly, maybe not slowly, but we were moving up through that and growing our overall share of revenue. And it only makes sense to focus on adjacent businesses when, if you're growing your core business, you got to stick to your knitting and make sure you really are successful at growing your core business.
You get distracted by that fastball.
You can get really distracted if you don't, particularly until you establish enough heft in the market. And a big part of that is sales heft. It's so hard. Chris would look at me and say, our product is so complicated anyway. It's hard to find salespeople that can sell this product. Having a sales team that is mature enough to sell different categories of products, it takes a very mature sales team to be able to do that. And it takes time to build that maturity in the sales team. And certainly in 2017, 2018, we weren't ready for it.
I remember you called me one day. You're like, I think we really got something. This whole world's going to turn into a data economy. I was like, what the hell you mean a data economy? What did you see there? Your long range vision where you believed that the world was going to shift into this area where you have this whole ecosystem living on these cloud databases. That was super interesting. Nobody was doing that at the time. What led you to that conclusion?
I'd watched just even in our own company, we were a very data-centric company at Snowflake. And, what I found amazing to watch was that, you would have people in different groups or part of the same group that would be arguing about how to do something or what to do in the marketplace. And, what I would always come back with is, have we measured that? Have we got the data to understand what's happening in the marketplace? And because of the nature of Snowflake, it was generally speaking quite easy to get that data. Sometimes we weren't collecting the right data, but you'd make that change. And then once you had a couple of months of that data, you could really begin to see trends and understand what was happening in the market. And I watched how disagreements evaporated when you presented people with data. And you could say, this is what the data says. And quite often it's not intuitive. I mean, I think of myself as a pretty intuitive person, but I know a lot of times my intuition is wrong about what the right thing to do is. And the data doesn't lie. If the data is properly collected and properly presented, the data doesn't lie. And follow the data every time. Now, of course, companies like Google and others had figured this out a long time before and were actually doing that in their business. But most companies weren't. I mean, most companies did not have the sophistication of systems to be able to do it. And our business at Snowflake was to provide those to customers so that they could solve those problems and present their employees and their customers as appropriate with information about the business to allow them to make better business decisions. So I knew this was going to happen because for the first time in history with products like Snowflake, you could put all the data together in one place and get answers that simply were impossible before. Now, what I missed in retrospect was what was going to change with the large language models. And we're now moving. I mean, I think the data economy is a short-lived thing. The data economy was like 2020 to 2023. Now it's an intelligence economy.
Yes.
And the data is a foundation, a necessary foundation. But the really interesting thing is the business intelligence that can now be built.
That's why I keep calling AI BI 3.0. That's really what it is in my mind.
And it's agentic software. We're now that we have the reasoning models exist. Built on the foundation of data, it becomes possible to really build intelligence and intelligent agents that replace, what people were doing manually in so many cases and can often do it quite better.
You look at this AI now, you're like, I've never seen anything like this before in my life. Like this kind of explosive transformational moment that we're living in, and you can see it's everywhere. And these machines are attacking every single workflow out there. And so these founders are all over the place creating these big businesses overnight. Where do you think this space is heading? Do you think it's overcrowded? Do you think it's chaotic?
Well, I've watched industry transformations. I mean, I saw the PC transformation. I saw very firsthand the internet transition. I saw the creation of packaged applications. I saw the cloud and SaaS. There's been this series of the phone and mobility, all of these transformations that have happened, which have created giant businesses for companies that emerged for the first time in those businesses. This one's bigger than all of them. I mean, this one is massive. It is something I never thought I would see in my lifetime. I always believed this would happen. I mean, I'm a fan of Isaac Asimov and robot, and what he wrote with the robot novels years and years ago, the robot stories years and years ago. So I always believed this would happen, but I didn't think it would happen in my lifetime. And here we are. intelligence, you can put intelligence in a bottle now for the first time and take things that before only people could understand and now have it be done by these agents. And now the models have advanced to the point where some things are really possible with agentic software that I don't even think were possible a year ago. I think the reasoning models have made a stepwise change, a significant stepwise change in the kinds of problems that can be solved. Now, there's still open problems. There's still a need to create semantic models that these reasoning models are built on top of, because they need to understand the semantics of the business in order to make good business decisions. But pretty rapidly, the pieces of technology are going to be put in place. And I think that while the model developers has been where a lot of the froth and the action has been, OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera, I do think over time that more money and more will be created in companies that are building agentic software to solve every business problem. And every category of application will be replaced in the next 5 years with an agentic solution. And that agentic solution will be much more flexible, much more cost effective, and much easier to use, and solve problems that frankly could never have been solved before than existing generations of applications.
Should humans worry about machines, just broadly speaking?
Well, I think we should, we should worry about a lot of things first and foremost. We should worry about our stupidity with wars and all kinds of things. There's a lot of things to worry about. I do believe that over time, more and more functions that people do themselves will be replaced by various kinds of agents and robotics. I mean, ultimately, robotics will replace things. I do think that will create a huge amount of opportunity for people. I think that the economies that it will generate will be much bigger than what we've seen before. So there's a lot to go around. The challenge with all of this is the speed at which it happens.
Right.
And so, in the long run, I think it all works out well, especially since humanity is not growing. I mean, when I was a kid, people were worried about overpopulation of the planet. Now we're worrying about underpopulation.
I agree with you. I feel like the biggest story on AI to me is it saves our asses in the United States because we have a declining birth rate. You got China's facing an existential challenge in terms of producing humans.
Korea's the worst.
Like that whole growth of humanity seems to be kind of tailing off. And so if we don't generate tons of productivity, we can't grow GDP without humans. It used to be capacity driven.
Always a correlation between population and GDP.
Right. Yes.
That's going to change.
The machines may change that calculus.
Now, I worry about the Uber drivers and people who today make their living off of functions that really will be replaced in the next 10 years, with automated solutions. There's just no question that's coming. We see
what do you tell young people? What skills do we tell young people to go out and get?
Learn data science is what I tell people. Not even computer science, data science. The crazy thing is how fast these models have replaced computer programmers. Absolutely, the first industry that's being replaced, or at least augmented, let's put it that way, is the computer programmer. The models are incredible at writing code.
I met a guy, I met the founder, I got to name this company because it's super interesting, Cursor.
Yeah.
I met this founder, this guy's 24, 25, MIT grad. Like these guys are young, but he comes across very mature. He comes across with the maturity of a 40-year-old, very smooth, very curious, very studious. And I'm fascinated by this because you're like, whoa, okay, so if the highest value function in all of tech is engineering, and these guys can figure out how to completely disrupt that need where you're always like, okay, I have to build a software company that's $1 billion and I need X number of engineers, get me to 100 million, 200 million, 300 million. It's always like the capacity seemed to always expand in line with the sales. Maybe not quite as much volume of humans in engineering as there was in sales, but a lot of engineers. And you go, okay, these generators can 10X everybody, which means there's 9 engineers we didn't have to hire. The question is, will those engineers percolate out into,
I think they will. The people that were doing computer science will, because they can easily adopt. I worry more about
more. In other words, what you're saying is going to be more surface area for them to participate.
I think there'll be a lot more surface area for them. They will find roles by and large. Lower skilled jobs, particularly those ones that can be replaced. They say the job that's the hardest for AI to replace is the gardener right now. That'll take a while before we have humanoid. We will. 2040.
10 years out, yeah.
2040, I think we'll have that. But, we already have, in San Francisco and in Austin and a few other places, cars that are replacing Uber drivers. That's a concern to me because people are feeding their family over that. And, and those people may have a harder time finding a different kind of job. That's a concern for sure.
I did not love the transition that occurred in Snowflake where you were no longer with the company. I remember that to my dying day, that conversation. And you made a decision very quickly to put the company first. I think we can both agree there are ways to do things and maybe ways that could be done less clumsily. Let's just call it that for the sake of being elegant here. But you ultimately had a tough decision where you were really, really not happy with certain dynamics at play, and you had to put Snowflake first. Tell me about that emotional moment for you where you built this thing we knew at that point was going to be an icon, and you put your blood, sweat, and tears in it, scratched out the company out of the dirt and created something worth billions of dollars that ended up becoming worth many, many, many tens of billions that will eventually cross over 100 billion.
It was hard. I mean, it definitely was hard. And was the hardest part about it was I didn't really know it was coming. And I should have, perhaps, because I was having some challenges with the board and I should have known, but because of the success we were having, I just didn't see that transition was going to come, at least certainly not as rapidly as it did come. But the reality is I love Snowflake and I loved what we built and I believed in it. And I still believe I'm still a pretty big investor in Snowflake. I'm still holding quite a bit of Snowflake stock, and I believe in what what we had created and what the team is still creating. And so in the background, I've been trying to help Snowflake in a lot of ways. I mean, I've been working with other companies that are in one way or another supporting Snowflake. A lot of people come to me and ask, how can I work with Snowflake? And I help to put people in touch and make the connections. So I've done what I can, not being a part of the company, to help support the company in the interim time. And it's because I believed in the company.
You put the company before your own everything.
Well, the company also, did a lot for me too. I mean, the company and ultimately the board and everyone else did a lot for me, which I'm very grateful for.
I'll never forget that because I see people in transitional situations, acting crazy and, being disruptive, not only to the companies, but to themselves. And it's just their colleagues. And it's so rough. I loved how you handled that. I just appreciated that very much because you always, from the first day you joined the company, you put the companies in the customers first and yourself second. You were in service to customers and your colleagues. That inspires me, man.
It took me a couple of days. To be fair, it took me a couple of days to get through it, but
not weeks, months.
Well, I mean, I made the decision to support the company, and do what I needed to do to support the company. It took about 2 days for that to happen. And then, honestly, for 6 months, I was, internally struggling to figure out what I would do. I mean, it took about 6 months to kind of fully work my way through it. But ultimately, I believe in what I've done and I believe in what I'm doing. And my goal has always been to make a difference in the world, to do things that help people, to build software that matters and build companies that matter. And, we certainly have done that with Snowflake, and I continue to try and do that now as I help a number of small companies. One of the things I enjoy the most is just talking to leaders, CEOs at different companies, which I do quite frequently. Sometimes I talk to them once, sometimes I talk to them every month. Most of these relationships are completely informal. I have no financial relationship with them whatsoever. But I like that the best because that leaves us both to be fully flexible in what we do. So if a company CEO doesn't see that they're getting any value, they won't call me. But when they do think they're getting value, they do tend to call back. So
when you look back and you say, okay, hey, founders, when you're constructing a board or taking money from different players, how should they think about constructing their board or taking money from this person to this person? I think Pat at Sequoia is one of the classiest people in the whole ecosystem. And I know he came in sort of later and helped you guys from a capital perspective get over the top. Young entrepreneur's journey, the early assembly of VCs and board members. What advice would you give these people?
I mean, I would say, what you said is find people who can help you build your business. And some of these investors are really good at it, and a lot of them are not that good at it. Most of them aren't that good at it, frankly. And some of them can bring customers to you. Some bring just pure advice and industry knowledge and industry wisdom. Some bring connections across the industry. I mean, all of those things can be very valuable, but work with people that can add value. Also bring in people that are domain experts. John McMahon was very helpful with Snowflake in terms of building our sales organization.
I mean, you didn't have any tail money. You had Spicer, you had Wally from Redpoint, John Waleska for our audience. Then you get Pat Grady, who's one of the greatest investors in modern history too, along with these other guys. Were Pat and Carl Eschenbach, who was the person who helped build VMware to a monster and then is now CEO of Workday, loveliest person in the world, as you know. Were they? Which one of them actually had the board seat? I don't remember.
It was Carl. Carl had the board seat.
Carl, okay. And Pat led the investment. Carl took the board seats. That was cool too, because so you get Pat, this amazing investor, and then he gives the board seat to Carl because he knew Carl could help you in the area you needed the most, which is mass scale.
Yeah, there was a lot of good people in a lot of good people. And of course, Mike.
Pfizer's genius, marketing and product and just vision, and his energy level for the company is astounding.
Yeah, John's a great guy.
I think of you as a founder of Snowflake. I know that you don't take that credit and whatever. There's a founder that has a title, but there was no real company before you joined. And then I also think of you as a founding character of Microsoft. And so you don't take any credit. You're too humble, which is great. But anybody who knows you would give you a ton of credit for Microsoft's multi-trillion-dollar outcome and Snowflake's absurd success too. What advice would you pass on to young people building companies? Just any parting wisdom, any thoughts?
So I would say, focus on something that you believe in, something that you can build a mission around, and something that makes a really big difference to the world, not something small, something that makes a big difference to the world. I learned this lesson early. I was at Rome. I was working on a software production system to help build software for our PBXs. When I joined that group, the software was a mess. Everything was totally broken. Nothing was working. I spent about 1.5 years cleaning it up, basically got it ready. The board was all excited because we were able to sell software we couldn't sell before, all that kind of stuff. And then I spent another couple of years working on it and nobody gave a shit about it. And I realized that once I'd fixed it, I was tuning it, I was polishing it, I was doing all these things to it and nobody cared. And I realized that it's just as hard to do something that no one cares about as just to do something that really makes a difference in this world. So focus on something that can be big and really make a difference. And that's why one of the reasons I joined Snowflake, when I realized what those founders had said that they could do, and I realized that architecturally what they said made sense and they clearly knew what they were doing. I realized this would be big if they were successful. And that's why I joined that company and helped to try to turn it into that. So focus on something that really makes a difference because you can put as much energy into something that doesn't.
I don't remember ever having a conversation in all the years I've known you about money. You never seemed to even care about it or talk about it. And yet it followed your passion for changing people's lives. You didn't chase it. It chased you in some ways. Would you say that's an accurate statement?
Yeah, when you do the right thing, I mean, I was fortunately I was early enough guy at Microsoft and grew through was successful at Microsoft. So, I was financially independent when I left Microsoft. And so I didn't really need to have any money to earn a whole lot of money. That's why I could take a $200,000 a year job. In fact, it cost me money. I was used to joke that I was living in Santa, in the Bay Area,
losing money to work.
I was paying more in California income taxes than I was making from Snowflake. But it was worth it to say the least because I knew I was doing something that was important and I had to be in San Mateo to be able to do that. So.
Bob, you are an icon. It's so good to see you. Let's talk soon, just in general.
Always good to catch up with you, Andy.
Really appreciate your contributions today. And I hope founders learn a ton. They really can learn a lot by studying a person like you. And thank you for your contributions to society. I genuinely mean that.
Well, Andy, you're doing the same, and I've always been so impressed by watching what you do, and you are also a force of nature.
I just care to see people creating businesses. So exciting. It's really just about wealth that feeds down, as you know, builds bridges, schools. Like it feeds society to create larger companies. To me, that's like the big thing. Is really, can you help founders create gigantic companies so that they employ lots of people and create lots of wealth that can circulate around society, not just for 5 people, but for 5 million people, for example.
Now more than ever, it's possible now more than ever. It's always been a good time in tech, but it's certainly the best time now.
This is fun, Mark. I will tell you, it's fun. This is getting fun. It's wild, but it's fun. It's like a rodeo. Who doesn't love a rodeo? All right, now listen, great to see you. Thank you so much for your contributions. Really appreciate it.
Take care. Thanks.